So thanks for having me. It's been a few years since I've been here at Cerner. I was part of an effort. I don't know how long ago that was, Sherry. What do you think? Three years ago? When you guys selected Workday as your core system of record for your HR, and it's great to be back. I don't think this building was around back then, so had it been, I wish we would have met here. This is much nicer. But today I have about an hour to visit with you and talk to you about some of the things that we do at Workday. I hope some of it applies. I hope some of it keeps you interested. If not, you can give me the verbal cues. Like if I start doing this, I'll move quickly. But by a show of hands, I'm assuming everybody here is pretty much from development. So is there anybody that's security focused? About 5% maybe? Okay. And then the rest, are we doing straight development? Yep, everybody nods. Anybody from the business? Meaning non-engineering types? Okay, 2 or 3 of you? Great. So I'll make sure that we have a good conversation and share the conversation that makes, I think, of most interest to you as we go through. At Workday, we like to do something called a fun fact. I know that you guys are big on culture. I'm going to bring you some of mine. So we always start our meetings with a little bit of like, who are you or what's unique about you to allow the audience to get to know you. So as you heard, my name is Joe. I grew up in Germany for a good portion of my formative years. Actually finished high school over there in a little town called Heidelberg. Has anybody ever been there before? Yay, one out of the whole crowd. Well, thank you. And sometimes people don't believe me. They're like, oh yeah, sure, you spent a couple years there. No, I was there for a very long time. So to prove that a guy can look good in leather shorts, there it is, proof positive. So you can't refute that. But I also wanted to start with this video.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
What's the number?
The answer is 13.
Really good.
But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
Isn't that true? Isn't it easy to miss things that we're not looking for? And I think both of our topics today kind of fall directly into that space. Both culture and security, if ignored, can really run amok. And I know that you guys have had a large emphasis culturally around how do you build culture and how do you sustain it. I've also had a great time visiting over lunch today to talk about what your security efforts look like and how you're looking to constantly improve the service and the security of your service as you deliver to your customers. So we're going to talk about some of that today, specifically from the lens of an operational side. As we get closer towards the end of the conversation that we have today, I will make some time for some questions. And I'm basically an open book. You guys can ask whatever you want, whether it's Workday-centric or just development-centric. I did grow up in my formative years in a dark cubicle cranking code, and I've spent a lot of time doing a lot of random stuff on IT side. So let's dive in for a second and talk about the things that matter, like space, the final frontier. I often equate space to kind of this analogy here. Do you think the astronaut ever thinks about his oxygen? Maybe a little bit, right? Until he's out there, maybe on the side of the International Space Station, and you drop the wrench, he's like, oh crap, that's gonna burn from the atmosphere, right? But a lot of times, security is like oxygen too, right? We don't really think about it until it's no longer there, and then what? And that's a very reactive mode. That's not a good place to be. Before you step off that shuttle, before you embark into promoting code into production, you have to think about security. It cannot be an afterthought because it's a very dangerous world. And you know, back in 2015, I became acutely aware of what bad security looked like. Specifically as I, among probably some of you here, had my security clearance information compromised by the OMB, right? Their database was hacked, probably by a state actor. And so Uncle Sugar, the good federal government of the United States, they sent me this letter. And they're like, don't worry about it. You're going to get free credit monitoring for a year. Does that sound like a good trade to anybody? I'm talking about everything, right? Every attribute of my most sensitive information and every attribute of my family's most sensitive information completely gone. And while I'm okay with kind of the binary and whatever stuff that's stored off, I can get a new social maybe someday. But I'm not Tom Cruise, and I really can't figure out how to get new eyes or new fingerprints. Not yet anyways. And that's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night, specifically as we develop and provide a service that also has very sensitive information in it. And so the unique thing, though, is that we have organizational alignment across every pillar of the Workday service. So I know a lot of your HR information, hopefully you're interacting with Workday today. I want you to feel good at the end of this talk, not bad, that we're actually doing our due diligence to make sure that the information that you commit to the service remains highly secure, as it is also still highly available for you as a consumer. But uniquely, our CISO at Workday does report into our CIO, like most organizations. But what's very interesting is that the CISO also has direct reporting responsibility into the engineering teams. So we also make sure that we have, for example, certified security black belts, if you will, across every one of our scrums as they meet and actually do code verification and validation through QA into a confidence level of prod eventually. We're going to talk more about that as we go through. But I wanted to put that up there, not only because he has a really handsome face, not only is he a really good friend, but I think the quote actually means something. It's really about the people. It's not really about the data. So this is what we constantly have to fight against when we talk about technical debt and technology, isn't it? You know, somebody has this bright idea, they're going to put that massive mobile home in the bottom. That's going to be your core system of record. And over time, you keep adding, right? And how do you connect them? You got these magic interfaces. They look like rails. I don't know how that works. But anyways, none of them look like they'd hold sand in a windstorm, right? Not highly secure, very fragile. And what's going to happen if something goes wrong? What's the cascading effect? What's that second and third order effect of something heinous happening? Well, we try to mitigate against that within the Workday service. We also try to mitigate this. So from a true SaaS provider, which is what we are, we don't deliver really a code-based mechanism. Your administrator who runs your Workday service here at Cerner never has to write this code, ever, and nor should we expect him to, or her, if you have somebody on the team. But the idea is that we want to make sure that we get rid of this from the consumer side because this is actually a threat vector. Wrongly written code that's poorly executed, that doesn't have the benefit of being checked against a larger community, can be a threat vector. And so we've intentionally said that we don't do this in the Workday service, so our configurations actually happen off through the UI, defined within the constraints that we provide as a service, so that nobody runs amok and finds themselves at risk or on the very good side or on the very bad side in a breach level situation. By the way, this code comes from another purported SaaS provider of HR. I'm not going to name who they are, but if I did, they'd be red-faced. So when we talk about this idea of just one, though, because we started in 2005 as a service, and you're like, gee whiz, I didn't know that. We thought about how do we mitigate some of those sins of the past around multiple product lines that are being delivered in tandem. And so one of the early decisions that we had as a service is that we're not going to do that. We're not going to support this notion of delivering product lines across different vehicles of deployment, whether it be on-prem or hosted or SaaS, true cloud, whatever you want to call it. We're going to do it one way. But most important for us from a technology side is that we wanted to stay true to this idea of experience, but even more important, these two principles of having a single security model. So I know that you had a DevCon with the Lord of the Rings theme, so you guys know about one ring to rule them all, right? Kind of creepy and eerie, but I'm going to apply that to our data and security for a second, but also to our data. We want to have one data model for everything that we do within the service. And that sounds maybe a little bit inflexible to the purest of engineers, but I want to assure you that 13 years on, it continues to serve us and our customers extremely well. And we'll talk about that why, what some of those added benefits are, and what you can think about as you look for consolidation opportunities and bring data under one roof, because there are benefits that are very tangible, not only for you, but for those for whom you serve. So when we look at this concept or this construct of SaaS, specifically from Workday's viewpoint, we did have that added advantage of being cloud first, right? So from a 2005 perspective, we didn't really start with any technical debt. Have we accumulated any over time? Candidly, the answer is yes. If I told you no, engineer to engineer, you'd say you're a liar and you'd probably start leaving immediately. But we didn't have any in the beginning because we started anew. And so the technologies, the frameworks, the applications, the supporting architectures, et cetera, were literally assembled to be cloud first. They were also assembled to be cloud only. We didn't want to, again, split our development, engineering, support, et cetera, across multiple product lines. We felt that would actually be a disservice over time. And so we've stayed true to that as we've gone forward. But there's two other principles specifically around security that we're very passionate about. And the first is that we encrypt everything. Every single attribute of customer data that enters the Workday service is encrypted at its restful state. We leverage AES 256 level encryption for every text entry, every keystroke, every document, every video, every photo, everything, no exceptions, is encrypted at its restful state. And while we have different storage mechanisms for that, whether it's going to be like the old Basho React, which is now defunct and open source, yay, or the MySQL, or when we talk about here in a minute, AWS, when we're talking about Aurora, those are all leveraging the same serialization and compression and encryption for all of that data at rest. But we also do something unique around that, and this has a little bit of a security lean around auditability. We audit every single transaction in the service forever, and we never offload that. That means you could be a customer for the entirety of our existence, so 13 years, and you can go back to the very first day of your riding on the Workday SaaS train, and you can look back at those audit records. Who did what, when, where, IP bands, and before and after values, if applicable. And when you think about that for a second, those of you who've played more than 3 days in any level of data, for example, how do you guys manage against that data? Right? What would you do with it? How do you store it? What's the serialization look like? How does the accessibility look like? And then again, how do I protect it without encumbering the service from performance level guarantees based on this massive wave that continues to build? Those are some of the things that we're going to talk about. But I also want to call it in the center that we deliver on a single platform. So there is no stretch out, even though we're talking about this idea of hybrid cloud now from private versus what we deliver from our own DCs to public with an AWS, which is going to be part of our topic today. The concept of the platform, though, remains homogeneous across both delivery models. And we'll talk about that as well. I alluded to this earlier, that our CISO reports to our CIO. But I also wanted to call out that those who also have, let's just call skin in the game around all things security, actually report up to different echelons of the company. And that's by design. We did not want our product platform folks, for example, to be influenced by our CEO or our CISO directly. We didn't want our governance and risk side from the chief privacy side to be otherwise compromised by other hierarchical chains that are trying to be pressured towards a delivery model of time or space, whatever it is, to get product out the door. So deliberately allowing for these different functions to coexist within the organization but have different reporting instructions allows them to have very friendly battles, right? Where we can meet out together and sometimes leave a little bit bruised, but still have the best interest ultimately of the consumer in mind as they fight for what's right, which is your right to party. So when we talk about segregation, we also talk about team focus. So when we looked at the right side, when we talked about the actual teaming under the product side, we look at this, for example, in our security and engineering. Anybody looking for a DevOps engineer? Because there's one of them out there that has 0 right now and I have 2 headcount, so let me know. I'm not recruiting from you, I can't do that. But from a team focus perspective, we look how this works and we even split it out from platform, right? So what serves the application to maybe the actual product itself. At the core of the Workday service is this massive compute called the object management services, where all of our in-memory object data lives, right? So we don't ever read or transact a disk. It's a total in-memory based application. And then also security product management. And I did take away their names because they're security folks, which means they're scared all the time, and they asked me not to put their names on there. Anyways. When we look at the general architecture too, each one of these teams has relevant oversight around different parts of the application stack. So whether it's at the client level, which is super high, down to identity or access in the core of the application, down to like keys. I told you everything's encrypted, so how do we manage those keys and decks? What does that look like from a wrapping perspective? And what does the rotational policy look like? And what happens if there is suspected compromise or whatever it is? How do we flesh that key structure for all of our customers? Every single one of them aligns directly to different portions, again, to ensure that we have those friendly arguments, sometimes called frenemy arguments, right? Where you can battle it out, again, in the best interest of the consumer. But the protective measures that we're putting out there, I've already talked about two, which are auditability and encryption. We also do things a little bit different. So I know back in the day when I was moonlighting as a wannabe DBA, and I could go to a console and I can do really cool things. I could do like, directory rehash or whatever it is. And I could key on the console and do queries. And if I wanted to, if I was a bad actor, I could actually query on the console and basically do a data dump and nobody would know, right? Is anybody's hair on the back of your neck standing up yet? Data direct access is great, but it also comes at a cost. You have to manage and mitigate risk at every layer. And of course, our DBAs that we hire are always the best people, right? Highly compensated, would never do anything wrong. But in an era of you don't know, maybe we want to mitigate that entirely by saying there is no concept of data direct access. All access to the data should flow through the application, which governs rights based on an RBAC type structure. And now you can go through and manage who gets to what based on what is their role and where are they in the org. There's also this notion of zero local data. So at session termination, regardless of what you're doing from a security perspective, the idea of an artifact at any level, beyond a cookie maybe, is probably really bad business. So when you guys think about developing your own applications, think about that. When the browser collapses, when the memory space on the phone is done after session termination on the app, what's left? Is there an opportunity for compromise? Is there a threat vector that has to be remediated? And that's one of the things that you ought to think about too, and things that we think about all the time, is how can we ensure that we stay true to a zero local data perspective. But also, what's very unique and why it's important for security to embed at all levels of the organization, specifically in a software development org, is to ensure that the controls that you're putting in place from an engineering perspective meet the requirements of third-party audit and certification. So for example, trust services criteria. This could get a little wonky, and bear with me for a second, but all of you guys impact the ability of your company to attest to the controls that are measured as part of these SOC reports, right? And if you have an ISO certification, the same thing applies. So the design considerations that you make absolutely impact your ability to prove to an open market that your applications meet the robustness and security that's required, specifically as you shift towards more public cloud delivery models, which you're doing today. So that's one of the things that you should be considering. In 2018 as a company, we had a lot of goals. These are some of our tangible deliverables. So native multi-factor. This gets me every time when I talk to folks, even Workday customers who think username and password is still sufficient in 2018. Folks, I MFA or two-factor pretty much everything that's available, including my financial services. So when I'm on my Bank of America, guess what? I'm getting a prompt. I have to actually authenticate two-factor. And I would ask you to consider the same, but also the applications that you use should be served natively capable for MFA to remediate against that risk of known actor having an ATO opportunity, whether it's through phishing or any of the other targeting methods, and then getting in and taking data that is not theirs to have. We also have this notion of view logging. So for those who have not had their head in the sand and didn't believe in the Chicken Little story, there was this thing that happened in Europe. It was a little thing called GDPR on May 25th of this year. And that was regulating a lot around what you could do with data, specifically data that belongs to people, right? And one of the things that was on there was being able to tell who viewed their data. Now, again, I did used to moonlight as a wannabe DBA. Database level auditing, anybody ever tried that? It's super hard. First of all, relational databases, if we're gonna be frank, are memory hogs. You can never give them enough memory because they'll always take it and then oink for more. But the issue is that how do you actually turn on that auditing to provide record level view while maintaining the robustness of a performant application? We mitigate that entirely because we don't leverage a relational data store at all in the transactional layer. And we can actually log off who's viewed what. So as of today, you as a Workday administrator can go in and be like, why is Sherry looking at Brian Gillespie's record all the time? Well, maybe because he's got a handsome face. I don't know, right? But you could actually go and prove that through an auditability trail into view level details, which is heretofore extremely hard to do. And then also simple things around step-up authentication. So there might be a critical event within an application state where you want the user to re-authenticate or to authenticate with higher privilege. So consider those as you look at those very kind of security-sensitive parts of an application. Should there be a step-up requirement? And if so, how would you present that to the user to be not only helpful, but also not very obtrusive as well? So our roadmap for 2018 had a lot, and we delivered it on most of it. ATO was a big deal for us because still, even today, people rely, like I said, on username and password alone. And so we've had to remediate against their inability to be more secure and provide a service that looks for patterns to mitigate against those threat vectors for them. And we continue to do that as well. You'll notice at the bottom, though, TLS encryption for AWS, and on the right, TLS and Workday data centers. That does not mean that we're not encrypting traffic in transit encrypted. Okay, so that's just standard. Everybody should be doing it. In fact, most services should be at least 1.2 level TLS encryption today. Although I did read on the news yesterday in Ars Technica, or maybe a couple places, that finally the browsers are going to finally deprecate TLS 1.0 and 1.1, finally. And yet there's still people in the world using IE 6 and 7, so whatever. The TLS encryption really means in-network, so node to node across any point where data might traverse. And this has kind of been the holy grail, but candidly, most of us in industry have trusted our own internal rings, if you will, as safe spaces, and that's just not as safe as they used to be, right? So we've designed with Linkerd and other open source technologies the ability to mesh security at every layer or every node within AWS to ensure that level of granularity security control as data passes between, for example, a router and a switch or whatever it is, right? In 2019, we're taking that same lessons learned from AWS in our exploration, putting the cart before the horse here a little bit, and bringing it back into the Workday data center. So the idea of having TLS encryption for every stop, every node of where your data might traverse, even within the trusted ring concept, that's the goal for us. And you're also going to see this idea of periodic key rotation around a KMS. We absolutely do that today, but the idea is how do we make that more robust so that users themselves can initiate that based on their requirements and not having to initiate a contact to us. So think about that for a second. So BYOK concepts, right? How do I actually bring my own key to you as a provider, a CSP or a cloud service provider, and say at this point, I no longer trust the validity of my key. I feel like I've had some level of internal compromise. Whatever the case, new key. And being able to upload that and manage that on their terms. That's one of our goals for 19. So we're going to talk about hybrid learning because for about 10 years of our journey, we did everything from our own private cloud, right? From the Workday data centers, or Workday managed data centers, rather. And so our journey has actually been happening for about the same time frame, but we weren't loading our entire application or software as a service application into AWS. We were doing it for a very unique kind of fringe application design sessions. So David Clark, who's one of our chief engineers over in Dublin, Ireland, likes to tell the story about how he took his Royal Bank of Scotland card. I don't know how an Irishman uses a Scottish bank, but let's not talk about that in public, right? And he would actually pay for his compute time on his own credit card as one of the early engineers of Workday. Okay, that's a little wonky, but I guess back then it was a pretty liberal expense policy and you could do whatever you wanted. But over time, we've acquired other technologies, like for example, our media cloud, which serves videos at scale, does all the compression across like 32 different formats based on availability of bandwidth, et cetera, or playback device. And that media cloud has always been in AWS. So as we acquired that technology, we had to think about how do we refactor our service to not only play good or play well within our own data centers, but to play in a very hybrid strategy to AWS to serve that content. Because really at the end of the day, it was just a content host. And quite frankly, I don't think anybody scales better than AWS from a content management perspective. I mean, even Netflix uses them, I think, right? And Netflix very rarely goes down, and when it does, the world freaking revolts, right? Because none of you here can watch your Orange is the New Black or New Girl, right? Very important. So, but also the innovation services that we continue to put into the Workday service, specifically around benchmarking. So we talk this notion of data as a service. Be able to take your data, promote it in a very de-identified or anonymized fashion, and then kind of have it brought back into your tenant so you can create baseline evaluations. So on the HR side, which you use today, like what does my turnover rate look like compared to peers in industry, whether it be by geography or by headcount or by revenue? What does my diversity metrics look like as a company? What does my salary or pay-per performance look like? Having those metrics brought back. And the idea is the democratization of data, right? Data's out there, folks, but the idea is can you use it and can you trust it? And because all of our customers are operating on the exact same representation of the data model, there's a high trust, right? And also a high use. And so now we can actually provide these things to our customers, and we actually provide it zero cost. It's one of those value adds that we continue to do from an innovation perspective. And then cloud platform, which speaks to all of the nerds in the room, right? Everybody here wants to get in and play a little bit deeper, including myself. So now this notion is that you can take Workday, you can take the tooling that we're providing through AWS as part of our cloud platform strategy, and now you can extend, enhance, build additional applications that ride sidecar to the Workday service and do cool stuff. But last year, we made a very strategic and deliberate public announcement that we're all in now, specifically for regions of the world that might be against, let's just call it political or geopolitical issues like, I don't know, the Patriot Act. Has anybody ever heard of that? And they didn't want their data stored in US-based data centers. Okay, fair. And so the first area, the first zone that we put into AWS was for Canada. So our friends from up north, right? They didn't want any of their stuff on our soil. Noted. And now we can deliver our single code line service through AWS to our Canadian customers. That's coming second to the United States, and stick around, watch the media. You'll see another European country announced as a third here in the next day or two as we wrap up our conference in Europe in Vienna. Wish I could have been there. So from a delivery comparison, I want to get this out of the way really quickly. What's the difference between delivering Workday from our own private cloud versus a public cloud strategy? Almost nothing. Right? So same SaaS, same performance, same SLA, same maintenance, same teams, same. With one caveat there, substantially similar controls and compliance reports, right? Because we measure our own data centers, we can't measure AWS data centers, right? They're gonna have their own SOC 2s and associated type reporting events. So the idea is that if we can establish effective parity between both private and public cloud, and let's move forward to this hybrid strategy, what does it mean for us to be able to provide a robust service, and what can we do more of? Because the models are truly the same. I mean, if we look at it at its core, what is it? It's an application riding on an abstraction layer that actually sits on top of mostly infrastructure as a service. There's some PaaS elements in there here or there, but it's mostly what we want is the infrastructure. So how do I take that metal in its rawest form, whether it's sitting in AWS or Workday centers, and how do I support a highly available application through abstraction? Now, as I take a quick sip and let you focus on that really horrible picture, clearly within our own data centers, we didn't necessarily think about an abstraction layer until we actually started to port, or had this idea of porting it into a very public cloud delivery model via AWS. And so how do we take separate infrastructure, separate tooling, separate environments, and still generate the same service? Well, the idea was to leverage abstraction to its full capability so that we can not only do it within AWS, but also take those same lessons learned and bring them back into our own private cloud and serve in like models entirely, regardless of infrastructure, regardless of the data center, et cetera. And so at its highest level, this is what we we went to. This was the goal that we sought and that we have effectively achieved. So everything that we're doing from a service perspective is coming out as a container from our pipeline. So from dev to test into prod in a very automated fashion. When it reaches the right confidence level, it's moved. Obviously, Kubernetes is serving as our orchestration layer within that larger effort. Yeah, there's tons of options out there. Why did we choose Kubernetes? I don't know, because it looked awesome. It's the flavor of the day, right? So we didn't want to use Swarm. Docker kind of didn't also ran around that for orchestration. They're really good at containers. I don't think they're as good at orchestration. That's just me. Hopefully this is non-attribution. But the idea is, how do we actually take that and manage it at scale and also do really cool things? And Kubernetes did really smart management around worker pools. And you're going to see that represented by nodes up there, by pods within each node. So now we can start to really do distributed compute. We can start to have that overlay. We can start to have that resilience of an application state. And it's effectively provided to us direct within the core of the application state. You're going to see 2 open source capabilities there with Flannel. That's mostly doing your kind of network type attribution across whatever you're deploying into. And also Calico, which is really doing your security enforcement from things like UI to the core processing, even down to other endpoints of your networks. But this also stays true to what we decided many years ago, is that when possible and where possible, open source is the way to go. And that doesn't mean that there's any attribution of risk associated with that. I actually think the opposite is true. If there's an open source project that has a ton of adoption, that means more eyes are on it. And the more eyes that are on it, the better the service becomes. It's just one of those rules of many eyes versus fewer eyes. It also goes back to this notion that inner cities are actually more dangerous than urban, and that's actually also not true. The idea of a higher density population with more eyes actually produces a safe environment per capita. And so that's the same way that we look at the open source community from a providing perspective. I talked about the automation of continuous integration of all of that code over time. And then when we talked about these AWS services, we thought, how can we actually create parity between what we're doing in our own data centers direct into AWS? And the answer was we couldn't. Let that sink in for a second. Not everything that we were doing in our own private cloud had direct correlation to a capability in public cloud. But we have learned some unique lessons learned that I'll share with you in a second that actually have had us rethink the way that we architect and deliver the Workday service back to our customers from our own data centers. And so we were talking about like the elastic compute side under EC2 and the EBS, EFS, S3 all on the store side. Aurora obviously is a MySQL-like, same encryption, same availability, same everything, but also around their key management for their HSM and KMS. They're doing some pretty interesting things on hardware-based like applications that are actually segmented to the unique deployment of every AWS instance. And so we have learned some lessons learned that I'll share with you as we go forward around that as well. If we look at our infrastructure design, we'd already moved to this notion of an availability zone with our own private cloud. But we wanted to actually take this native presentation that AWS already basically offers in their VPC structure. And so you're going to see the AZ1 and 2 effectively mirrors, if you will, of the 2. That's going to support something that we're going to talk about here in a bit around zero downtime. So as a service, we don't plan on downtime in the future, and we'll talk about what that really means. All of your standard out there, right? From the boring NAT that's always around that you have to SWAT at. Security groups, we're talking about their F5s being leveraged, Palo Altos. You're going to see a lot in here that's actually name brand and not necessarily open source, but it doesn't really get, in our opinion, much better. And having talked to some of your folks today, we're leveraging a lot of the same technologies. But what's interesting is the automation, including CloudFormation. So we talk about these tools, when we talk about the services that are available, a lot of this is already out there for your teams to leverage. So that was one of the things, is one of our lessons learned is automate as much as possible to ensure that we reduce the risk of manual intervention from steps along the way. So if we roll back a few more years, we used OpenStack within the Workday service within our own private cloud. It's a great automation tool when you think about like resilience, when you talk about prediction, et cetera. But AWS has some unique tools that also afford a lot of that provide insight into where the service is going and allow you to spin up or spin down as necessary. And then finally, on the security side at the bottom, of course, AWS is going to have their own tooling out there, but we don't think that's probably sufficient at this time. Just know that I think more is sometimes better than less, and that might be counterintuitive, but we took a lot of the same monitoring tools that we have internally, and we actually projected them and had them look forward to the AWS instances. We have candidly found some things as we've done that were not caught by AWS's tooling, which leads me to believe that they're just not there yet in their entirety. I can share more of those details one-on-one because I certainly want to have that attribution on Joe's name on a video. So lessons learned. Lessons learned between this hybrid notion, like where we're going and what it means. You have to be very thoughtful as you take your technologies that you're leveraging with success in your own private data centers, and as you start to port them or even think about porting them to something else, right? So part of our evaluation technique is, will it provide the same level of availability, scalability, and also security control? If it can meet all three of those, availability, scalability, and security from an encryption perspective, then it was a good move. Like in the case of swapping MySQL for Aurora with an AWS. It met all three criterion, and it was a good to go. Another lesson learned was early on in a process, specifically as you venture towards new infrastructure, establish teams early on so they can become process owners and domain experts and also shape. Because what's worse than having 2 cooks in the kitchen? 80 cooks in the kitchen, right? So for example, as we decided to go along this series of abstracting, right, not only within AWS, but also rolling it back into our own DCs, we established a Kubernetes team. That was our platform of choice for orchestration. And that team is responsible for setting out charter, if you will, organizationally about how it should work. What does it look like? What open source tooling are we going to leverage, whether it's Flannel, Calico, et cetera, as part of that larger effort? And also at the same time, continue to embed security and compliance into those teams from the very beginning. If you don't have that happening in your teams today, maybe that's one of those gentle recommendations that you make, is that you put a security engineer into every one of your teams as you build, as you promote, and as code moves from its very infant state to a production-ready state. Also, treat infrastructure as code. Make sure it's versioned in a way. Don't sit there and kind of wave it off and not document as you go along, because eventually you're going to find yourself in a very precarious situation where the person who actually developed it and knows the intricacies of it is no longer there to explain or mansplain or hersplain all that code to you as it comes out of the library, and you're like, oh, I don't even know what happened here, right? I don't know whatever stored classes you pulled in here, and it all looks like mess. But treat it like code, version it, and also document it. What's interesting too is the immutable side of infrastructure within public cloud. In private cloud, it's literally like building a fine chocolate, right? Layer over time. And it becomes a work of art in and of itself, right? The problem is that you build it layer and layer over time, and you're responsible for all of that nougaty stuff that you don't like that's in the middle, or maybe that almond that you're allergic to, but you're still gonna have to put it in your mouth and chew. On the other side, with public cloud, I don't care. I'm going to save that data off, and I'm going to burn down the entire infrastructure and regenerate it within hours, right? Or even minutes in some cases. And that's pretty interesting. Specifically, as you're documenting it and you have these lessons learned, you're like, man, I just did not like the way that setup worked. I felt like there was a little bit of compromise. Maybe things just weren't flowing appropriately. Whatever. Set the match and walk away. The idea is that we want to make sure that as you develop, that you don't find yourself in the rigidity of what was yesteryear's data center, where it is a layered type application kind of design structure, and you're responsible for all the collected debt over time. Data, save it off. If it's not working from an infrastructure side, wash it away. That's better than saying burn it down at this point. Also, automate. I said this on the previous slide, and it feels like I can't say it enough. But we are fallible creatures. Like, we make mistakes, right? We're tired, we're hangry, right? Somebody didn't have their Snickers, right? I can see you. I know, you know who I'm talking about, right? And so the idea is if I can automate it, That automation also provides inherently documentation of what happened when, right? And effectively an audit trail associated with it. And so if there is a triage event, if there is something that happens, an incident response required, you kind of have a record by the guy that was hangry and just pulled the wrong lever. And then finally, monitoring is critical. Don't trust the things that are out there. Don't even trust Workday, right? And I don't mean that to be bad about Workday, but trust but verify. Monitor all of your services. That doesn't mean that somebody's sitting in a dark corner, like clicking on Workday to ensure availability. Of course, that could be automated, but also monitor the services that serve your applications. Not only from an availability perspective, but from a security perspective. I know you do a lot of that today with dynamic and static code analysis and things like that. Probably IP boundary attack, or at least friendly attack, right? But making sure that you do that at every level of the development organization. Every level of the development organization. All of you, at your very root, you're all security engineers. If you don't believe that, maybe you should go back to the video game room and think about it for a minute, and then come back out to work, right? You're all security engineers first and foremost. So make sure that you treat that as one of your primary responsibilities. So even though we've had a lot of learning as we've moved to this hybrid model, we've also had some eureka moments. So this is where we get to be like, yay, eureka. But also this comes with some level of trepidation for us too, because we're in some level of uncharted territory, even as a cloud-based service provider. So let's talk about a couple of those as we round out. So this first is the network effect. You guys probably read that in some teacher's manual in academia and summarily threw it away after the test was over, and you're like, I'll never do that again in my life. So does anybody have a positive example of a network effect that you've seen in the consumer space? Is anybody old enough to remember analog, not digital cell phones? Okay, yeah, those are pretty epic, right? It kind of worked. And then I was a Sprint Spectrum customer back in the day, like rewind a lot of years. And I remember when Sprint PCS came out, everyone's like, oh my gosh, it sounds like I can hear them breathing in my ear. Like, that's creepy. But the quality became infinitely better, right? And then we got so jazzed when we can download a photo and it looked like this. Remember that? I'm not even talking about videos yet. I don't want to know what videos you're trying to download. But those pictures came slow. Now the pictures come like this. Now the videos come like this. And we've seen this network effect as more people jump on this bandwagon. It gives the opportunity to build a more robust, available, and better product in the end. So if you haven't heard already, I think Sprint's like there somewhere, right? You guys are going to, and I think you're going to be part of T-Mobile eventually. I'm not sure how that works, but the idea is that 5G is right on the corner. The continued piling on of this network effect is producing tangential results that mean significant things to many people, even to areas that are so rural that landline doesn't really even work. And now they can actually get to the internet. Imagine that. So this idea then of a network effect, of this taking this cue from the consumer side of the internet, where we see things working like with Amazon or Netflix or whatever it is, the idea was like, well, can we do that at Workday? Can we do that for our customers? Or maybe I should ask you, can you do it for your customers? You guys have some pretty big clients. I think DoD is one of them, right? Yeah, that's a lot of people, me included. I'm probably gonna be sitting in your EMR eventually and be like, wow, that's pretty gross. But this idea is that as we continue to evolve the service, as we continue to make it more epic with every single update year over year, when I came into this organization, we didn't even have HTML5. We were still using a Flash Flex framework. Can anybody say boo? Yeah, let's do that together. We thought it was necessary to create a rich, kind of modern-looking environment. Well, no, that's boo. And we got rid of it entirely, right? So the idea of a plugin or support from a browser perspective all goes away. But look what everything else has happened over time. And of course, we have made acquisitions, and that tests our ability to mitigate technical debt at every single turn. The majority of times that we have made acquisitions, though, we've been very purposeful about making either acqui-hires, right? Just taking the brain power and saying, yeah, that was nice, let's just go do it here. Or we do a thoughtful deconstruction of the IP, which in this case means intellectual property, not necessarily the engineers. We don't want to deconstruct engineers, it's bad. And take that and then refactor it into our single code line delivery model. There are, however, areas in the future where that might not happen. And we have to think about that from a debt perspective and how we manage and mitigate around that, specifically as we stay true to single security and single data. So when we take those cues, what do those mean for us from a challenge perspective? Has anybody already had enough of the conversational interface yet? You've had enough? Okay. So you talked about talking to Alexa when you got your weather, right? Like what's the weather outside? And she told you it's 19. You're like, yeah, I can wear shorts again. So this idea that the conversational interface is going to solve everything, it sounds pretty epic, but I will tell you candidly that it would actually solve some things for me, even as a Workday user. Like I despise having to log in and to provide feedback. I'm a really good feedback giver. I just don't like to log into an application, go to a profile, go to the task and get feedback. So what if I could actually take that and expand it to whether it's me talking into my Android because I'm a true nerd's nerd, right? Anybody with me? You're all iPhone users? All right. So, or whether it's, basically doing it anywhere else, whether it's being extended into a natural workspace, which we'll talk about in a second. The idea is that sometimes the applications that we make aren't necessarily best served within the application frameworks that we deliver. Does that make sense? Let me pause for a moment, let that sink in. Sometimes we get too married to how we deliver an application and think that it couldn't be better than this. Well, that's what every guy thinks as he gets fatter and balder and older, right? But the truth is that we have to stay relevant in every relationship. And so the idea then is maybe it is better outside of the Workday UI, right? So that brings me to this next area, which is the natural workspace. Workday's had a lot of success lately in healthcare. A lot of major healthcare systems coming over and leveraging us for our full suite of applications. And I wonder, honestly, at night, when I'm thinking about what does it mean for the charge nurse who's walking the floor at 2 a.m. with massive responsibility to provide critical care to people who need it most. Does she really have time to log into Workday to do a transaction that's HR related? Or could she just do it by either speaking into a phone or maybe leveraging any of the technologies out there that are already part of her or his day-to-day operation? Right? So at Workday, we're a huge Slack shop. It saved my life in a big way. I used to get about 300 emails a day organizationally. I'm down to about 50 right now. Because now we've technically channelized all of our communications. And so what if I'm on Slack and I said, hey, /feedback, right, invoking a command, give feedback to, I don't know, Joe Korngable, who's my boss. What's the feedback? Write it in there, done, it's committed, it's finished, or it's a time off request, or it's a PTO declination, whatever it is. Being able to do those things where you work best. And I think about that in the context of healthcare, and I'm like, well, maybe somebody's already in an EMR. So maybe if they're in a CERN or if they're in another application, maybe they should be doing some of those events within the EMR that they're already in basically the entire shift anyways. And that's, I think, the future of work is where people work best. And so maybe we need to all rethink and become a little bit emotionally detached from the presentation side and focus on the delivery and security side. We talked about this earlier, the opportunity to take data in context and create a true apples-to-apples comparison. I think that you have some products around this today, specifically focused on the healthcare domain. But the idea is, what can we do with data that's homogeneous, that's secure and canonical, that's absolutely representative based at its core layer? While it might be different in the actual inputs of the abstract, it absolutely has the same structure, the skeleton's the same. So what can we do with that? Can we create, on the human capital side, analysis around headcount or experience or education? On the financial side, could we say, look, our billing is actually really weak in comparison to our peers of size, scale, and revenue? Maybe we ought to tighten that up. Maybe we ought to think about things that we can do as an organization to get to a net 30 or a net 15. What is our inventory spend? Specifically in hospitals, being able to look across your peer groups and say, am I doing off-contract spend? Like, why does this one surgeon always want the Cadillac of catheters, right? We already have a contract for those. And honestly, the person doesn't even know because they're already asleep when it's going in and out, right? I don't know. So the idea is that you can have this data then to actually make rich, informative decisions to make the business better. Ultimately, this benefits the consumer. It's not necessarily for you, but when you think about the way that you produce and manage data, specifically data that is sometimes federated, and if you have an opportunity to bring it back into a common data model, common security model, you win. Those are the things that I think are really there. And then maybe a picture of my Christmas table every year when my children lie to me with dear sweet eyes and say, we will totally help you build this puzzle. No, you won't. And their poor mother and I sit there and slave for like a day and a half. Have you ever built one of those Coke Christmas puzzles of Santa drinking a Coke in a snowstorm? Do you know how hard it is to find the puzzle piece in the snowstorm? They're all white. Good luck, right? And so that's the idea with data too, because when we think about this data, when we think about it scaling, think about how much noise is out there in the data sphere today. And everybody's looking at that for that proverbial needle in a haystack. They're looking for that signal. They're looking for that direction, that guidance. And the problem is, and that probably the real crime, this is me being very opinionated, as if I haven't been already, is that the terms that I'm using right now, like machine learning, have been overused and misappropriated in the media to such a degree that actually does a disservice. Because it's hyping along that peak of inflated expectations, and it's going to land almost everybody in this trough of disillusionment. That's what Gartner calls it. A few of those technologies will escape to the slope of enlightenment, but not many. And a lot of people will become completely disenfranchised in the process. But if you have secure canonical data, if it is representative, if it is homogeneous, if you will, and you have it at scale, which is the next biggest thing, Netflix, the recommendation engine, would suck if it was based on Kansas alone. It would suck if it was based on Texas alone. The reason it works is because it takes secure canonical data at scale that's homogeneous at scale. That's the key. And so being able to do really cool things, like things that we're already doing today around recommendations, around maybe anomaly detection that we're doing within our own data centers, so as we mitigate against account takeover. Being able to leverage that ML across that data to do cool things. On our expenses, we leverage OCR. We've had to train that model over time. And because we're so security aware and maybe risk averse, we didn't take one of the obvious things. The obvious choice is to go buy an OCR utility and plug it into your system, or offload it as a service and just have calls go to it. But again, every single one of you here, your first duty is that of a security engineer. We made a very purposeful decision to actually do the hard route and train up our own models for OCR internally because we wanted it to be within the nested control, our controls as a service. Harder, but definitely, I think, more secure for our customers in the end. And then finally, this notion of zero downtime. So in case you didn't know it, every Friday night between like 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., if you tried to go in and I don't know, look at your paycheck or whatever it is that you do, you can't. None of you know this because none of you party till 3 a.m. on Saturday morning, right? None of you? Even the guy with the beanie in the hat? No? Okay. You kind of look like a party animal. So this idea is that how do we mitigate against that? So in Amazon, in our foray into this public cloud model, we've absolutely achieved it already, and we're delivering it to Amazon as a customer in early 2019. So this idea is going to be zero planned downtime. We will no longer have maintenance windows for any of our pushes, whether they be bug fixes or otherwise. That doesn't mean the service will never go down, because it's software, right? And maybe we just suck less sometimes at things, right? But the idea, you can actually use that tagline if you want internally, right? It's software, we might just suck less. The idea, though, is that we want the service to be as available as any of the public consumer-type applications out there. When's the last time Gmail went down that you noticed? Exactly, right? Because it's free, and you'd be so pissed as a free consumer, you'd be like, oh, I totally didn't pay for this, why is it down, right? Well, imagine if you will, that somebody's paying millions of dollars a year for Workday as a service, and it's not available. Even in a planned state, it's kind of depressing. We can do better. And I challenge everybody that I talk to think about how you can take your services to a zero planned downtime moment. We're doing it in 2019 in AWS, And the plan is to bring it back to our own data centers with the lessons learned in 2020 for all of our customers. Which means that we go back, let me back up for a second. When I first joined the company, 23 hours of downtime 3 times a year to move from one update to the next, right? And now we're basically about 2.7 was the last update for all of our customers. So vital reflections, what can I leave you with before I open up for a couple of questions here in the last few minutes? The first is you guys have this unique opportunity to shape the future, right? So some of you wanted to be superheroes when you were younger. Well, guess what? You are. You might not be wearing a cape, but you get to do stuff every day that actually makes a difference. And some of it's pretty epic. You are leaping buildings in a single bound, right? From a development perspective. But to be true to that and to actually be successful, you have to have integrity. And one of the things that just gets me is this idea of a lack of integrity, specifically from developers and engineers, right? So if you have a deadline, right, your Scrum is actually working on something very important and you can't get there, do not falsify through the Scrum Master. Don't falsify anything to say that you're going to get your code commit on time. If you can't, be early and honest, right? So you don't end up like this, where Brutus the Beefcake walked in, he's like, I want this flying Pegasus of death painted on my back. And the dude's like, I gotcha, right? But he didn't get it. He got Sprinkles the Cupcake Pony, which is nothing like what he wanted. Don't be that guy. Have integrity. And also avoid traps. And by traps, I mean, some of you in here probably think this is actually really a flat screen television, right? Some of you are shaking your heads yes. Walls don't lie. You can always peek around the corner, right? And that's where you find the nasty that is integration, that is technical debt, that is everything else that tries to serve up what looks like a modern experience, but quite frankly isn't. And some of those guiding principles that I ask folks to look for, not only internally, but also externally, is how can I deliver a service that's in the public cloud where all of the data is encrypted? And I know that's a huge litmus test, right? But this is 2018. Let's get smart. Let's figure it out. We also want to deliver a service that provides absolute auditability for every transaction to create attribution for who did what when, right? So that's another test. Like, can we get there? And it might not always have to be at the database layer, right? It can actually be done in the application state. But can you produce that irrefutable evidence of who did what? MFA, for those in the room today, if you're not using it, even for your banks, repent now, right? Enable that. I mean, they all do it. USAA, Bank of America, it doesn't matter. Use MFA, but also for your applications. And I know you're using Duo corporately today. It's a native authentication link within the Workday service. It works pretty easy. It's a click and you're into the service. Make sure that as you develop, you don't allow for artifacts to be left behind. Nobody needs to see your dirty work, right? Nobody needs to see the mess that's left behind at a session end. As you develop, as those baseline security engineers that all of you are, make sure that you support the security attestations and certifications that the company aspires to. Because everything that you do actually impacts the ability to achieve these based on the measures or the statements of applicability, which are measured to achieve said certification. So if you guys think with the right hat, you'll support the business, which also supports the consumer. This notion of backdoor, I don't believe in it anymore. I actually used to do SQL console stuff like I told you. I used to do it as a web developer. It's 2018, I don't believe it anymore. I believe applications should govern access. That's a good measure for security, and you guys should consider that as well as part of your strategy. And then think about TLS not only at the external side, right, from an endpoint to endpoint across the public internet, but also internally. Like, how can I secure all of my communication protocol across every node of the transaction? And if you can get there, I think you provide a more available, hyper-resilient, and also hyper-secure type of an application that people can actually know and love and trust. So with that, I've taken you on a little bit of a journey about where we've come from, some of the initiatives that we've done around hybrid cloud, the emphasis on security that is actually super important for us. Key takeaway is that how many security engineers are embedded into every single team? 1. That was the first finger that went up. I can't count you because I already had lunch with you, so you get a Panera gift card. The second, see me right after this. The second takeaway is is we have a belt certification program for all of our security engineers. Yes, it is bragging rights, but it's run by our CISO, and every single one of those is embedded to actually make sure that as the code, as it goes through the levels of confidence, meets the intent of our security guidance and directives that are internal. That is a great practice, but at the end of the day, if you can't afford that from a manpower or scale perspective, at the end of the day, every single one of you in here can operate as that security engineer. So I'll go ahead and pause for a couple questions. If you'll just yell it out, I'll repeat it. If there are none, we'll be done.
Technical errata. Were there any high-level discussions about, since I'll commend you on the use of Duo, with the use of Duo, they are still allowing SMS authentication. As you might know, NIST is going to be deprecating that in the future.
Yep.
Were there any high-level discussions about that? And then the SSF7 hijack that's really, getting to be more common in mobile space?
Yeah, so as you know, just got bought, Duo just got bought by Cisco, right? Interesting organization, interesting pairing. I mean, SAP just bought Qualtrics, whatever they're called, for $8 billion. So high M&A activity happening in the market today. Completely agree. I think SMS is probably the worst delivery model for a challenge response mechanism. There's other ways to do that that are far more secure, like Duo's non-use of SMS, which is the challenge through the application state itself. I would recommend as you look for those things to say that is completely not appropriate in the future. But I say that with a little bit of pie in the face because our native MFA that we deliver as part of the service that has nothing to do with a third-party MFA utility actually does leverage SMS today. And it's cringeworthy at best, but it's still at some level more secure than just using a password alone, right? So there's a level of confidence that we need to mature through. And I think at this point, we're just trying to swing for the 80% and hope the other 20 doesn't bite. But completely agree, SMS as a future state from a MFA standpoint is bogus and wrong, and nobody should be doing it. Same as TLS 1.0 and 1.1, or SSL v3, which is still, by the way, in the internal bowels of a lot of applications out there today, which frightens me to death, but totally. Yeah, Starbucks for you.
So my question actually goes right into what you just said. So TLS 1.1 and 1.0 should be gone. SSL 3.0 should have been gone a long time ago. Are you guys totally off SSL 3.0,
We
TLS
are.
1.0, and TLS 1.1?
Completely.
Okay.
In fact, within 2 days of the, what was it, Heartbleed? Which one was it that did SSL 3?
There's too many, I can't remember.
Yeah, but that first one that came out,
Yeah.
we completely remediated against it within 2 days. It was just one touch and everything got fixed.
How do you go, so clients that you have today, right? Some
Yeah.
of them are going to be using things that are only TLS 1.0
Correct.
or 1.1. How do you go and interact with those clients and make sure that they're upgrading?
Notices through our community, right? So if we have a massive change that would affect security for all, we absolutely send it out through community, through the name support contacts, so everybody gets it, but they have to move. If there's something that's so egregious to the larger ecosystem writ large, people have to act. And that was one of those acts. So for example, a lot of those old IEs that were running out there, sorry, Charlie, upgrade, or better yet, go to something more robust like a Chrome that's auto-updated. Or
So do you have something written into contracts that say like, this is a thing you have to do regularly, and if you don't, then okay.
Yeah, so the service is dependent based on security, which is a carve out for us. So if we need to actually do something that's, I won't say catastrophic, but could be disruptive based on the needs of providing a highly available and secure service, the answer is yes.
Thanks.
Cool. Thanks everybody for your time today. If you have any other questions, I'll stick around for some one-on-one.